There is a moment, just before the sun rises over the Cumberland Gap, when the world seems to hold its breath. The sky above the Appalachian ridges shifts slowly from deep blue-black to the softest grey, the color of old stone, the color of still water. The mountains are not dramatic in this light. They are patient. They have been patient for a very long time. Their rounded shoulders rise and fall in long, gentle waves, ridge after ridge after ridge, stretching north and south as far as the eye can see, disappearing finally into a haze that is not quite cloud and not quite mist, but something in between, something the mountains seem to breathe out on their own in the quiet hours before dawn. Down in the valleys, the fog moves differently. It pools and drifts and finds the low places, filling them slowly like water filling an ancient bowl. It softens the edges of things. The dark line of a creek becomes a suggestion. The distant shape of a farmhouse becomes a ghost of itself. Even the sound of the world changes. A bird call echoes longer than it should. The rustle of leaves in a small morning wind travels farther than expected, carried somehow by the cool, damp air in ways that only this landscape seems to understand. And then there is the gap itself, a natural notch cut into the ridgeline right at the point where Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee meet at their corners. It sits at an elevation of roughly 1,300 feet, modest by any measure of mountains, and that is precisely the point. In a wall of stone that runs for hundreds of miles without meaningful interruption, this particular opening in the rock is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply exists as it has always existed, a quiet break in the long green wall of the Appalachians, and through that break, for thousands of years, living things have moved. Before we go any further into this story, and it is a very long and very beautiful story, we want to pause for just a moment and say, if you are settling in tonight, if you have found this place, and you find it peaceful, please consider subscribing to History's Sleepy Time and leaving a like on this video. It means more than you might imagine to a small channel that loves quiet history, and we would genuinely love to know where in the world are you watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments. Now let us go back to the mountains. Dr. Thomas Walker, a Virginia physician and explorer, passed through this gap in 1750 and named it for the Duke of Cumberland, though the gap itself had been known to indigenous nations for far longer than any European record could reach. Walker's journal entry describing the passage is brief, almost offhand, as if the gap, for all its significance, was simply the next thing encountered on a long journey westward. And perhaps that is part of what makes this place so quietly extraordinary. Its power was never in spectacle. It was in access. When the Wilderness Road was later cut through the gap, under the guidance of Daniel Boone and his party in 1775, an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 settlers would eventually use it as their primary route into Kentucky and the interior of the continent. For a generation, it was the great highway of the American frontier. It was the door through the mountains. But here is a question that the morning mist seems to ask, drifting as it does through the trees and across the stone, sliding slowly downward into places that sunlight has not yet touched. If the mountains became a gateway for people above, what hidden pathways may have existed below? because beneath the feet of every long hunter, every pioneer family, every indigenous traveler who crossed this ridgeline, the stone itself was not solid. It was carved. It was channeled. It was honeycombed in places, with passages that no road would ever follow, that no map of the frontier would ever record. Water had been at work here for an almost incomprehensible span of time, finding its way through the limestone in the slow, patient way that water always does, not forcing, not breaking, but dissolving millimeter by millimeter, century by century, carving a second landscape entirely hidden beneath the first. And if you stand in the right place, in the quiet just before full sunrise, and you listen past the birdsong and past the wind, you can sometimes hear it. A sound like a whisper. A sound like water moving somewhere beneath your feet in a darkness that has never seen the sun. Let us follow it. To understand what lies beneath Cumberland Gap, you have to be willing to travel in time, not by decades, not by centuries, but by hundreds of millions of years. The stone that makes these mountains is old in a way that resists easy comprehension. It is old the way the universe is old, not in a way you can truly picture, but in a way you can feel, standing at the edge of a limestone cliff and running your hand along a surface that was once the floor of a shallow sea. That is where this story truly begins, not with mountains at all, but with water, a warm, shallow ocean that covered much of what is now the eastern interior of North America during the Ordovician and Silurian periods, roughly 450 to 400 million years ago. In those ancient seas, life was abundant in ways both alien and familiar. Corals built reefs, mollusks filtered water. Marine organisms of extraordinary variety lived and died by the billions, their shells and bodies drifting slowly to the seafloor, accumulating in layer upon layer of calcium carbonate, the mineral foundation of limestone. Over immense spans of time, these sediments compacted. They cemented. They turned slowly from soft organic material into stone, dense, pale, and chemically reactive in one very specific and consequential way. Limestone dissolves in the presence of mildly acidic water, and rainwater, moving through soil rich in decaying organic matter, becomes mildly acidic almost immediately. This chemical relationship between water and limestone is the engine of everything that would follow. But before the caves could form, the mountains themselves had to rise. The Appalachians are not one mountain range in the geological sense. They are the result of multiple continental collisions played out across hundreds of millions of years, each one building upon what came before. The most significant of these events, the Alleghenian orogeny, occurred roughly 300 to 325 million years ago, when the ancient landmass of Gondwana, which would eventually become Africa and South America, collided with the eastern margin of North America. The collision was slow by human standards, advancing perhaps a few centimeters each year, but it was relentless, and its effect was enormous. The seafloor sediments that had been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years were not simply buried by this collision. They were pushed upward, folded, and faulted into ridges. The limestone layers that had once lain flat and horizontal on the seafloor were tilted and compressed, sometimes bent nearly vertical, pushed one over another along great fault lines that still define the structure of the Appalachian ridges today. What had been a shallow sea became a mountain chain that, in its early stages, may have rivaled the modern Himalayas in height. The gap itself sits at a point where the Cumberland Overthrust, a major structural feature of Appalachian geology, brought older, harder rock up and over younger rock beneath it. The result was a ridge of unusual character, one where the layers of stone tell a complicated story of compression, movement, and deep time. And within that story, the limestone played its particular role, soluble, layered, and fractured, already containing within it the seeds of every cave that would one day form. But mountains, even great ones, erode. Over the 300 million years since the Alleghenian orogeny, wind and water and ice worked steadily on the Appalachians, wearing them down from their ancient heights to the gentle rounded ridges we see today. The harder rock resisted longest, forming the peaks and spines of the ridges. The softer rock, including much of the limestone, was worn away more quickly, and as it eroded from above, the processes that acted on it from below became ever more significant. Karst. The word comes from a region in Slovenia where this type of landscape was first studied systematically, but the phenomenon it describes is found wherever soluble rock, limestone, dolomite, gypsum meets moving water. Karst landscapes have a particular quality to them, a sense of hidden depth. On the surface, they may look like ordinary hills and valleys, fields and forests, but beneath the surface, they are anything but ordinary. In a karst landscape, the normal rules of drainage do not fully apply. Rain does not simply run off the surface into streams. Much of it disappears into sinkholes, into cracks in the rock, into underground openings that funnel water downward into a hidden drainage system that operates entirely out of sight. The valleys in karst country sometimes have no surface streams at all. The streams are there, but they are underground, moving through passages dissolved out of the rock by centuries of mildly acidic water. Sinkholes are perhaps the most visible signature of karst on the landscape. They form when the ceiling of an underground void collapses under its own weight, or when surface soil slowly washes down through cracks in the limestone beneath. In the Cumberland Gap region, sinkholes appear scattered across the landscape like shallow bowls, some barely noticeable, some dramatic depressions in the ground that open suddenly and without warning. Each one is a window of a kind into the world below. Fault lines add another dimension to this underground architecture. Where the crust has fractured along fault planes, water finds preferential pathways, following the lines of least resistance deep into the rock. The faults that shape the surface ridges of the Appalachians also shape the underground drainage patterns, creating a correspondence between the visible geography above and the hidden geography below that geologists have spent generations trying to map and understand. Springs are the other visible expression of this hidden world. Where underground water intersects the surface, at a cliff face, at the base of a ridge, at the edge of a valley, it emerges as a spring. Some of these springs are small and quiet, a seep of water through a mossy rock face, barely distinguishable from surface runoff. Others are large enough to form the headwaters of significant streams. In karst country, springs are not simply water sources. They are exits, points, where the underground river system surfaces into daylight, briefly visible before it joins the surface drainage and disappears again downstream. The caves that form in karst limestone begin as cracks, the natural fractures and bedding planes that exist in any layered rock formation. Water enters these cracks, dissolves the limestone along the walls of the fracture, and slowly widens it. A crack becomes a fissure becomes a passage becomes a chamber. The process is extraordinarily slow by human standards, measurable in millimeters per century in some cases, but given geological time, it produces results of remarkable scale. In the Cumberland Gap region, this process has been ongoing for tens of millions of years. The landscape has been reshaped by erosion, by river downcutting, by changes in the regional water table driven by large-scale climatic and tectonic events. Each phase of this history has left its mark on the underground system, old. Dry passages that once carried water but now sit high and abandoned above the current water table, active stream caves at lower elevations, still being carved today. Flooded passages deep in the system where the rock remains saturated and the water table has not yet dropped far enough to leave them dry. The result is a layered underground landscape, just as the surface landscape is layered, old passages above, newer passages below, and the whole system connected by shafts and fissures that water uses to move between levels. Stalactites grow downward from cave ceilings where mineral-rich water drips steadily. Stalagmites rise from the floor beneath them, built grain by grain over thousands of years. Flowstone coats cave walls and floors in smooth sheets, preserving within its crystalline layers a record of past climates, past rainfall, past temperatures, an archive written in stone in a darkness where no human eye has ever read it. The mountains above the gap are beautiful. There is no question of that, but the landscape beneath them, built over 400 million years, shaped by continental collisions and ancient seas, by fault lines and acidic water, and the patient logic of chemistry acting on stone, that landscape has its own beauty, a darker beauty. A quieter one that has never needed sunlight to be extraordinary, and through that underground landscape, water has always moved. Water does not wait. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the hidden hydrology of the Cumberland Gap region. While the surface world moved through its seasons, while forests grew and burned and grew again, while surface streams carved their visible valleys, while the gap itself was crossed by 10,000 generations of living creatures, the water underground did not pause. It did not rest. It continued its work, moving through the stone with a patience and persistence that has no equivalent in the human experience of time. The underground rivers of the Appalachian karst are not rivers in the way we usually imagine them. They do not have wide, visible banks. They do not catch the light of the sun. Many of them flow in complete darkness, through passages too narrow for any human body to follow, through chambers no one has ever entered, through flooded tubes of rock where the water presses against the ceiling and leaves no air gap at all. They are rivers nonetheless, carrying water, carrying dissolved minerals, carrying fine sediment, carving their passages millimeter by millimeter in the endless chemistry of water meeting stone. To understand where these underground rivers come from, it helps to begin at the surface and follow the water downward. When rain falls on a karst landscape, it does not behave as it would on granite or sandstone. Much of it, sometimes the majority of it, disappears almost immediately. It flows into sinkholes, or it soaks into cracks in the limestone pavement, or it enters cave openings directly, cascading down into the darkness in small waterfalls that no one is there to see. As it moves downward, it carries with it a slight acidity, carbonic acid formed when rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from the soil above. This acidity is gentle. It would cause no harm to a human hand dipped into it. But to limestone, it is steadily corrosive over geological time. The water percolates through the unsaturated zone, the epikarst, where it moves between soil and fractured rock, gradually losing some of its acidity as it dissolves limestone along the way, but retaining enough to continue its work as it moves deeper. Eventually, it reaches the saturated zone, where all the pore spaces and fractures in the rock are completely filled with water. The upper surface of this saturated zone is the water table, a surface that rises and falls with the seasons. Rising after wet periods and falling during dry ones, and that has slowly descended over geological time as rivers cut their valleys deeper and the regional drainage adjusted to the changing landscape. It is in the saturated zone and just above it that the most active cave formation takes place. Water moving along fractures and bedding plains dissolves limestone preferentially where flow is greatest, widening those passages more quickly, directing yet more flow toward them, creating a feedback system that focuses the underground drainage into a relatively small number of efficient pathways. Over time, a dendritic pattern emerges, like the branches of a tree or the tributaries of a river system, except all of it invisible, all of it underground, flowing from the high country toward a point of resurgence, a spring, where the water finally re-emerges at the surface. The relationship between the surface landscape and the underground drainage is not always obvious. In a normal river basin, you can look at a topographic map and trace the drainage divide, the line along which water on one side flows one way and water on the other side flows the opposite way. In karst country, this surface divide does not necessarily correspond to the underground divide. Water that falls on one side of a surface ridge may, underground, flow beneath that ridge and emerge on the other side entirely. The mountains that look so solid and definitive from above are underground, often permeable in ways that completely defy the apparent logic of the surface geography. This is particularly relevant at Cumberland Gap. The gap sits at the junction of three states and at a significant divide in the surface drainage. Water falling on the Kentucky side drains westward and northward, eventually into the Ohio River and onward to the Mississippi. Water falling on the Virginia and Tennessee sides drains eastward and southward, eventually toward the Atlantic. But underground, in the karst system, this surface divide is less absolute. Underground water does not always respect the topographic boundaries that surface water follows. It finds the path of least resistance through the rock, which may cross beneath a ridgeline that surface streams cannot. Hydrogeologists have used a technique called dye tracing to begin to understand these hidden connections. A small amount of non-toxic, biodegradable fluorescent dye, typically fluorescein, which gives a bright green color to water, is introduced at a known input point, such as a sinkhole or cave entrance. Detectors are then placed at springs and other potential output points, sometimes miles away, and monitored over days or weeks for the appearance of the dye. When the dye appears at a distant spring, it confirms a hydraulic connection between the 2 points, a connection that runs through the limestone entirely underground, invisible to any surface observation. Dye tracing studies in karst regions of the southern Appalachians have revealed connections that astonished researchers, underground flow paths that cross beneath surface drainage, divides that travel miles through rock in timeframes ranging from hours during flood conditions to weeks during dry periods, that connect seemingly unrelated surface features in ways that only the underground geometry of the rock can explain. In some cases, a single large karst spring has been shown to receive water from a drainage area many times larger than its surface catchment would suggest, because its underground catchment extends beneath ridges that surface streams cannot cross. The seasonal dimension of this system is important. During wet seasons, typically winter and early spring in the Appalachians, the water table rises, flooding passages that are dry at other times of year. Flow rates in underground streams increase dramatically. Water that normally trickles through tight passages rushes through in surges. Cave streams that are placid and knee-deep in August can become raging, ceiling-touching torrents in March. This seasonal variability makes cave exploration not merely difficult, but genuinely dangerous during high water periods, and it also means that parts of the underground system are accessible, if at all, only during a narrow window of favorable conditions. Springs are the most intimate connection between the underground and surface worlds, and the springs of the Cumberland Gap region have been significant to every group of people who has ever lived here. A reliable spring means fresh, cool water even in the height of summer. It means a camping place, a settlement site, a gathering point. The springs that emerge along the base of the ridges in this part of Appalachia are fed by underground systems that may reach miles back into the mountains, systems that have been functioning since long before any human ever looked at them and understood what they were. The largest karst springs can discharge astonishing volumes of water. Mammoth Cave, to the northwest in Kentucky, the longest known cave system in the world, is part of a vast karst drainage system that includes massive springs discharging into the Green River. The karst systems of the Cumberland Gap region are not on the same scale as Mammoth Cave, but they share the same fundamental geology, the same limestone, the same karst processes, the same underground logic. What differs is primarily scale and the particular geometry of the local rock structure. Water also preserves. Inside caves, where temperature and humidity are stable, where there is no freeze-thaw cycle and no direct weathering from sun and wind, organic materials can survive for extraordinary lengths of time. Bones of animals that fell into cave entrances, pollen deposited by ancient vegetation. the shells of snails carried in by underground streams, and the cave formations themselves, the stalactites and stalagmites, which incorporate oxygen isotopes from the water that built them in ratios that reflect the temperature and rainfall patterns of the climate that existed when each layer was deposited. A single stalactite sliced carefully along its length and analyzed layer by layer can reveal tens of thousands of years of climate history, droughts and wet periods, cooler and warmer intervals. The advance and retreat of glaciers far to the north, whose effects rippled through the regional climate and were faithfully recorded in the chemistry of a cave formation growing in darkness beneath the Appalachian ridges. The water beneath Cumberland Gap, then, is not simply water. It is a record. It is an archive. It is a hidden text written over millions of years in the language of chemistry and geology, stored in stone in chambers where no light has ever penetrated, waiting patiently for the instruments and techniques that might, someday, allow us to read it fully. And long before those instruments existed, long before any of the science we have been describing was even imagined, people came to this place. They stood at its springs. They sheltered in its rock overhangs. They walked its ridges and its valleys. They knew something of this land that no scientific study has fully captured. It is time to meet them. The mountains were never empty. That is the first and perhaps most important thing to understand about Cumberland Gap before the era of European settlement. When Daniel Boone led his party of axemen through the Notch in 1775, when Thomas Walker paused to record the gap in his journal a quarter-century earlier, they were not entering a wilderness untouched by human presence. They were entering a landscape that had been known, traveled, and inhabited for an extraordinary span of time. A landscape that held within its soil and stone and rock shelters the accumulated evidence of thousands of years of human life. The earliest confirmed human presence in the southern Appalachian region dates to the Paleo-Indian period, roughly 14,000 to 10,000 years ago, in the centuries following the last major glacial maximum. The great ice sheets that had covered much of northern North America were retreating. The climate was shifting, warming slowly, becoming more like the climate we know today, though the process was neither steady nor smooth. The forests of the region were different then. Spruce and fir grew at lower elevations than they do now. Megafauna, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, and camels of species long since extinct still moved through the landscape, though their time was running out. The people who moved through this world were skilled, adaptable hunters and gatherers. They lived in small, mobile groups, following the rhythms of a landscape that was itself still adjusting to the end of the Ice Age. We know them primarily through their stone tools, distinctive spear points, carefully flaked from high-quality flint or chert that have been found at sites across the eastern half of North America. The Cumberland Gap region, sitting at the junction of major geographic features and offering access to multiple drainage systems and ecological zones, would have been a significant point on the mental map of these early peoples. But it is important to be precise about what we know and what we infer. No Paleo-Indian site directly within the narrowest boundaries of the gap itself has been excavated and published with the kind of detail that allows confident interpretation. What we do have is the broader regional pattern, a clear archaeological record of Paleo-Indian occupation across the ridge and valley province of the Appalachians, and a strong theoretical basis for thinking that natural geographic corridors like the Gap would have been used as movement routes for both people and the animals they followed. The Gap was not simply a convenience. It was, in the geography of the southern Appalachians, almost an inevitability. For anyone moving between the interior of what is now Kentucky and the eastern slopes of the mountains, the Gap offered the most direct and least demanding route through a ridgeline that was otherwise formidable. Animals following seasonal forage would have used it. People following those animals would have used it. And this pattern, once established, would have persisted and deepened across generations until the route itself became embedded in cultural memory. As the climate continued to warm and stabilize through the Archaic period, roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, the human populations of the region became more complex, their relationships with the landscape more varied and intimate. The megafauna were gone by this point, and subsistence strategies shifted toward the hunting of white-tailed deer and turkey, the gathering of nuts, seeds, and roots, and the exploitation of riverine resources, fish, mussels, and the plant communities of floodplain environments. Rock shelters, shallow overhangs in cliff faces, where an overhang of harder rock protects the ground beneath from direct rain, were particularly important to archaic peoples throughout the Appalachian region. They are not caves in the full sense of the word. Most are simply indentations in the cliff face, open to the air and light, offering protection from rain and wind without the total darkness of a deep cave. But they concentrate human activity in a small space over long periods of time, and the result is an accumulation of cultural material, fire-cracked rock, animal bone, plant remains, stone tools, and their manufacturing debris that archaeologists can use to reconstruct the lives of people who left no written records. The ridge and valley region that encompasses Cumberland Gap is well supplied with rock shelters, and many of them show evidence of repeated, long-term use spanning thousands of years. The same shelter that offered protection to an archaic hunter 10,000 years ago might show evidence of use during the woodland period 2,000 years ago, and again in the historic period. This continuity of use reflects something real about the landscape. Certain locations are simply better than others, and people recognize and remember that quality across generations. The woodland period, spanning roughly 3,000 to 1,000 years ago, saw significant changes in the culture and society of the peoples of the eastern woodlands. The adoption of pottery, ceramic vessels that allowed food to be cooked and stored in new ways represented a shift in mobility and subsistence strategy. The construction of earthen mounds for ceremonial and mortuary purposes revealed the development of more elaborate social and religious structures. And the exchange of exotic materials, copper from the Great Lakes region, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the southern Appalachians, across networks that spanned hundreds of miles, showed a degree of connectivity between distant communities that challenges any simple notion of isolated, primitive hunter-gatherers. Cumberland Gap sat, during the woodland period, within a region of intense cultural activity. The Hopewell interaction sphere, the name archaeologists give to the network of exchange and shared ceremonial practices that linked woodland communities across a vast geographic area, reached into the southern Appalachians. And the Gap region was a natural point of transit for people and goods moving between the Ohio Valley and the Tennessee drainage. Stone tools made from distinctive flint sources in central Kentucky have been found in archaeological sites east of the Appalachians. And marine shells from the Gulf Coast appear in woodland period sites deep in the Kentucky interior, movements that suggest the use of established routes through the mountain's roots, of which the Gap was certainly one. The caves and rock shelters of the region also played a role in the ceremonial life of woodland peoples. Deep cave exploration, the movement of people beyond the twilight zone into the total darkness of cave interiors, has been documented at sites in the broader region. Most famously at Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, where woodland period peoples entered the cave system for what appear to have been mining and ceremonial purposes, collecting gypsum and other minerals from deep within the cave. Torch remnants, woven grass sandals, and gourds left by these ancient explorers have been preserved in the dry passages of Mammoth Cave for over 2,000 years, remarkable evidence of the human relationship with underground space long before the era of speleology. Whether similar deep cave exploration took place in the cave systems of the Cumberland Gap region is not clearly established in the published archaeological record. What we can say with confidence is that the pattern of caves and rock shelters serving as significant sites within indigenous landscapes is well documented throughout the broader region, and there is no geological reason why the karst systems of the Gap area would have been an exception. It is also worth noting the practical importance of caves and underground springs in the lives of people who depended entirely on their direct knowledge of the land for survival. A cave entrance that maintained a steady, cool temperature in summer could serve as a natural refrigerator for perishable food. A spring emerging from the base of a limestone cliff was a reliable water source even during drought. The geography of karst, which could be treacherous in its sinkholes and unpredictable in its drainage, was also a resource, one that required knowledge and experience to use well, but that rewarded that knowledge generously. This knowledge accumulated over thousands of years, passing from generation to generation through the direct experience of living in a particular landscape. It was not written down. It was not mapped in any form that would survive to the present. But it was real, and it shaped the lives of every group of people who called this part of the Appalachians home. And as we move forward in our story, it is essential that we carry this understanding with us, that the Gap and everything beneath and around it was known. It was not a blank space waiting to be discovered. It was a landscape already dense with human meaning, already woven into the lives of people whose connection to it ran far deeper and far further back than any written record could reach. To speak of the indigenous nations who knew Cumberland Gap is to speak of multiple distinct peoples, each with their own history, their own language, their own relationship to the land, and it would be a significant mistake to blur those distinctions into a single, generalized story. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Yuchi, and other nations who inhabited or traveled through the southern Appalachian region in the centuries before and during European contact were not interchangeable. They had different origins, different social structures, different ceremonial traditions, different ways of understanding their relationship to the mountains and the waters and the underground world. What they shared was a landscape, and even their relationships to that shared landscape were shaped by their particular histories and perspectives. We should also be honest about the nature of the sources available to us. The documentary and written record of indigenous traditions in this region was created largely by European and American observers from the late 18th century onward, people who brought their own assumptions and misunderstandings to what they recorded, and who frequently oversimplified or distorted what they saw and heard. The oral traditions themselves, maintained within communities as living knowledge, are the more authoritative source, but they belong to those communities, not to outside interpreters, and should be approached with appropriate humility and respect. With that understanding clearly stated, let us consider what can be said with care and accuracy. The Cherokee Nation, whose historic territory covered a vast region of the southern Appalachians, including parts of what are now Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, had a deep and complex relationship with the mountain landscape. The mountains were not simply a resource or a backdrop to Cherokee life. They were a living presence, imbued with meaning that was woven through every aspect of Cherokee spiritual and cultural understanding. Specific mountains, specific springs, specific river confluences were places of particular power and significance. Water in Cherokee tradition was understood to have properties that went well beyond the physical. Springs and rivers were associated with spiritual forces, with the possibility of healing, with transitions between the ordinary world and other realms of existence. The concept of the underworld in Cherokee cosmology was not a simple or easily summarized thing, and it would be a disservice to reduce it to a one-sentence description. What can be said is that the underground world, the world beneath the surface of the earth and beneath the water, was understood to be real and significant, populated with beings and forces that intersected with the human world in particular places and at particular times. The caves and springs of the Cumberland Gap region existed within a Cherokee geographic and spiritual understanding of the landscape, even if the specific traditions associated with those particular features are not always accessible in the historical record. Cherokee oral traditions preserved knowledge of the landscape across generations, knowledge of roots, of water sources, of places of significance, and the gap itself, as a major mountain pass on the western edge of Cherokee territory, would certainly have been part of that geographical knowledge. The Shawnee present a different story. The Shawnee were a mobile people whose history involved movement across a wide geographic range, from the Ohio Valley to the Cumberland Plateau and the Tennessee River drainage, and eventually under the pressure of colonial expansion much further. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the Cumberland Gap region lay within or near the territories through which Shawnee people traveled and sometimes lived. The Shawnee were formidable hunters, and the Kentucky interior, reached most directly through the gap, was hunting country of extraordinary richness. The Long Hunters of the early colonial frontier, moving through the gap in the mid-18th century, entered a landscape where Shawnee hunters were already operating. The tensions that developed between Long Hunters and Shawnee parties, tensions that were sometimes violent, and that reflected a fundamental conflict over access to the land and its resources, are documented in the historical record. But those tensions should not obscure the prior and deep Shawnee knowledge of the region. The routes that Long Hunters and later surveyors followed were often routes that indigenous peoples had traveled for generations. The Yuchi, also known as the Tsyaha, people of the sun, were another distinct nation with a presence in the southern Appalachian region. The Yuchi language is a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language family, which suggests a long and independent history in the region. Yuchi traditions speak of a deep connection to specific landscapes and waterways in the southeast, and Yuchi communities maintained their distinct identity and cultural heritage even through the profound disruptions of the colonial and removal eras. There were other nations too, the Chickasaw, whose territory lay to the southwest, but whose hunters and traders moved through the broader region, the Creek Confederacy, which encompassed multiple distinct peoples in the southeast. Smaller communities and groups, whose names and stories have not always survived in the historical record, but whose presence in the landscape was real. What is common across these diverse traditions, and what we can say with confidence, is that mountains and waterways and underground spaces were understood as meaningful, not as neutral geography, but as places with histories, with presences, with relationships to the human world. Springs that emerged from underground were not simply hydrological features. They were places where the hidden world briefly touched the visible one. Caves were not simply geological formations. They were openings, thresholds of a kind whose meaning was culturally specific and deeply considered. Mountain passes, too, carried meaning beyond the purely practical. A place where the ridgeline opened, where movement between two great geographic regions was made possible, where the wind moved differently and the view extended in new directions. Such a place was likely to be significant in ways that went beyond simple utility. The gap was a crossing point not only for bodies and goods, but for the full cultural and spiritual geography of the people who used it. It is also worth reflecting on what the landscape looked like in the centuries before European settlement, before the clearing of forests for agriculture, before the hunting pressure that would eventually diminish deer and turkey populations, before the introduction of horses and firearms that changed the dynamics of movement and subsistence. The forests would have been older, denser, more biologically diverse. The springs would have run cleaner. The karst wetlands and cave-fed streams would have supported fish and mussel populations of a richness that is difficult to imagine today. The landscape was not pristine in any mythological sense. It was actively managed and used by the people who lived in it, but it was abundant in ways that early European observers sometimes noted with astonishment before their own presence began to change it. That abundance was not accidental. It was, in part, the result of generations of careful, knowledgeable relationship between people and land, a relationship that included an intimate understanding of where the water came from, where it went underground, and where it re-emerged. The springs and sinkholes and cave entrances of the karst landscape were known. They were named in languages whose records are incomplete. They were visited for reasons both practical and ceremonial. They were in a word that the English language cannot quite translate from any indigenous language, but that every indigenous tradition seems to contain. They were respected. That respect is itself a form of knowledge. And it is knowledge that was already ancient when the first European explorer stood at the edge of the gap and looked westward into the green depths of the Kentucky interior. In the autumn of 1750, a Virginia physician named Dr. Thomas Walker led a small party of men westward through the Appalachian Mountains on behalf of the Loyal Land Company, a speculative venture hoping to claim land grants in the interior of the continent. Walker was not a simple frontiersman. He was educated, observant, and methodical, the kind of man who kept careful journals and made note of what he saw with the trained eye of someone who understood that information was as valuable as the land itself. On April 13, 1750, Walker's party passed through a notable gap in the mountain wall they had been following, and Walker recorded the event in his journal, naming the pass for Prince William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. The entry is not dramatic. Walker was a practical man, and his journal reflects that practicality, distances traveled, game encountered, the quality of water and grass for the horses. But the naming stuck, and Cumberland Gap entered the documentary record of European exploration. Walker was not the first European to approach the gap. There is evidence that earlier traders and hunters had passed through the region, and there were certainly rumors and reports circulating in Virginia and the Carolinas about the great opening in the mountains and the rich country beyond it. But Walker's journey was among the first documented in detail, and his journal provides a window into what the region looked like at the very beginning of sustained European attention. What Walker found on the Kentucky side of the gap was a landscape of extraordinary richness, dense forests of hardwood, abundant game, clear streams, good soil. He and his party explored a portion of the Kentucky interior before turning back, pressed by time and the difficulty of the terrain. They had found what they were looking for, at least in general terms. The land was there, the route was passable, the opportunity was real. It would be another quarter century before that opportunity was systematically exploited. And when it was, the man most closely associated with it would become one of the most famous figures in American frontier history. Daniel Boone was born in 1734 in Berks County, Pennsylvania, into a Quaker family that eventually settled in the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina. He was by all accounts, and by his own evident temperament, a man most at ease in the forest, a skilled hunter and woodsman who spent extended periods in the Kentucky interior during the late 1760s and early 1770s, learning the land with an intimacy that few European-descended men of his era could match. Boone's extended hunting expeditions, the long hunts that could keep a man in the wilderness for months at a time, gave him a geographical knowledge of the region that was both broad and deep. He knew the river systems, the ridge lines, the salt licks that drew game, the caves and rock shelters that offered refuge. He had almost certainly encountered the karst landscape of the Kentucky limestone country, the sinkholes, the springs, the cave entrances that appeared without warning in the forest floor, and navigated around or through them as part of his everyday movement through the wilderness. In 1775, Boone was commissioned by Richard Henderson and the Transylvania Company, another land speculation venture, to cut a road through the Gap and into the Kentucky interior that would allow settlers to follow. The route that Boone and his party of axemen blazed was not created from nothing. It followed, in large part, paths that already existed, indigenous trails worn by generations of travel, game traces that followed the logic of the landscape, routes that long hunters had used in the years before. The Wilderness Road, as it came to be known, ran from the Holston River settlements in what is now northeastern Tennessee northwestward through the Gap and onward into the Kentucky interior, eventually reaching the settlement of Boonesborough on the Kentucky River. It was not a comfortable road. For years it remained a rough trail, barely wide enough for a loaded pack horse, treacherous with mud in wet weather and broken by creek crossings that offered no bridges. But it was the route, and its existence opened a floodgate. The settlers who poured through the Gap in the decades following 1775 came in extraordinary numbers. Families with their entire worldly possessions loaded onto horses or carried on their backs. Herds of cattle and hogs driven along the trail. Soldiers during the Revolutionary War period, when Kentucky became both a prize and a battleground. Surveyors and speculators, preachers and physicians, blacksmiths and farmers and people who simply wanted more land than the eastern seaboard could any longer provide. Most of them passed through the Gap with their eyes on the horizon ahead. The mountains were an obstacle to be overcome, not a subject of interest in themselves. The cave entrances they passed, the sinkholes that appeared at the side of the trail, the springs that emerged from the base of limestone cliffs. These were practical features of a practical landscape, noted for their usefulness or their hazard, and otherwise not dwelt upon. But some of the men who moved through this country were more observant about the underground landscape than simple utility would require. The long hunters, who spent months at a time in the wilderness by choice, developed a knowledge of the terrain that went beyond the obvious. Caves were useful as shelter from weather, as places to cache meat and hides, as natural landmarks in a country with few others. Some long hunters explored cave passages by torchlight, drawn by curiosity or by practical need, moving into the darkness as far as their lights and their nerve would carry them. We have some historical record of this early cave awareness in the broader Kentucky-Tennessee-Virginia region. Journals and letters from the late 18th and early 19th centuries occasionally mention cave discoveries. a hunter following a wounded animal into a cave entrance, a party sheltering in a large cave during a storm, a sinkhole that swallowed a portion of the trail without warning. These accounts are not systematic. They are not the observations of trained naturalists or geologists, but they are evidence that the people of the frontier era were aware of the underground landscape in a general way, even if they lacked the conceptual framework to understand what they were seeing. The early cartography of the Cumberland Gap region reflects this awareness in its own way, or rather, in its silences. The maps produced by surveyors in the late 18th and early 19th centuries show the surface features of the landscape with increasing precision: ridgelines, river systems, the location of springs and settlements. But the underground is absent from these maps entirely. Not because the surveyors were unaware that caves and underground rivers existed, but because the technology of the time offered no way to map what lay beneath the surface. The underground remained, on paper at least, a complete blank. There is something poignant about that blank space on the early maps, that white silence beneath the carefully drawn ridgelines and river courses, representing a world that was present and significant and completely beyond the cartographic tools of the era. The frontier was mapped above. The frontier was not mapped below, and the frontier below was waiting. It was water that first revealed the extent of what lay beneath, springs that appeared in unexpected places, streams that disappeared into the ground and reappeared miles away, sinkholes that swallowed heavy rains without trace. The surface landscape was full of signals pointing downward, if anyone had the curiosity and the conceptual framework to follow them. That framework would come slowly, in the 19th century, and then more systematically in the 20th, and we will follow it in due course. But first, let us spend a moment more in the world of the early frontier, where the gap was a busy place, where the wilderness road was worn deep by thousands of feet and hooves, and where the mountains kept their underground secrets in the only way they ever had. In patient, geological silence, the springs still ran cold from their limestone sources, the sinkholes still swallowed the rain. The underground rivers still moved in their darkness, indifferent to the commotion above them, the axes and the campfires and the cattle lowing and the children crying and the whole extraordinary human drama of a continent in motion. Beneath all of it, the stone was simply there. Old beyond imagining, patient beyond comprehension, keeping, as it had always kept, the slow and secret record of its own long history. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only underground. It is not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a forest at midnight, or even the silence of a mountaintop above the tree line where the wind has briefly stilled. It is something more complete than any of those. It is a silence with texture, a silence you can almost feel pressing against your ears, against your skin, against the small sounds your own body makes as you breathe and move and exist. It is the silence of a place where no wind has ever blown, where no rain has ever fallen directly, where the only sounds are the ones that water makes as it moves through stone in the dark. This is the silence that cave explorers, speleologists, as they are properly called, enter when they move beyond the entrance zone of a cave past the twilight, where daylight still reaches faintly into the interior, where their headlamps become the only light that has ever existed in that particular space. It is a humbling experience by most accounts. The darkness is not simply dark, it is absolute. Switch off the lamp and you cannot see your hand pressed against your face. You cannot see the passage you entered through, or the ceiling above you, or the floor beneath your feet. You are, for that moment, as blind as anything that has ever lived in these passages has always been. The cave systems of the Cumberland Gap region are not, in the published speleological record, among the most famous in the world. They do not have the name recognition of Mammoth Cave to the northwest, or the Luray Caverns of Virginia to the northeast, or the vast systems of the Ozarks, or the Edwards Plateau of Texas. They exist, in a sense, in the shadow of those more celebrated underground landscapes, less studied, less mapped, less visited, and for those very reasons, perhaps more genuinely mysterious. What is known about the karst systems in and around the Cumberland Gap area comes from a combination of surface geological mapping, hydrogeological studies, and the work of regional cavers and speleologists who have explored portions of the accessible cave systems over the past several decades. The picture that emerges from this work is of a landscape with significant underground complexity, karst development spread across a geological setting that includes multiple limestone formations of different ages and characters, cut by faults and fractures that provide pathways for underground drainage, and expressed at the surface in sinkholes, springs, and cave entrances that hint at the extent of the system below. Some cave passages in the region are accessible, at least in part. Rock shelters and shallow cave entrances appear along the cliff faces and ridge flanks throughout the area, the same features that provided shelter to archaic peoples thousands of years ago. Some of these openings lead to passage systems that extend back into the mountain for significant distances before the passage becomes too tight or too flooded or drops into a vertical shaft that requires specialized equipment to descend. Vertical shafts, called pits or drops in caving terminology, are a particular feature of karst systems in the Appalachian region. Where water has moved preferentially along a vertical fracture in the limestone, it may dissolve a shaft that drops tens or even hundreds of feet through the rock, opening at the bottom into horizontal passages that spread in multiple directions. These shafts are among the most challenging features for cave exploration. Descending them requires rope and technical climbing equipment. Ascending them requires even more. And at the bottom, the passages that open up may immediately encounter flooding, requiring diving equipment to proceed further, or they may pinch down to a size that no human body can follow, regardless of the desire and determination of the person pressing against the stone. Flooded passages, sumps, in caving terminology, represent perhaps the most significant barrier to the full exploration of deep karst systems. When a passage drops below the water table, it fills completely with water, leaving no air gap. To move beyond a sump requires either waiting for water levels to drop, which may happen seasonally, or may never happen at all in passages that are permanently below the water table, or using self-contained diving equipment in conditions that test the limits of what even highly trained cave divers can safely manage. Cave diving is widely recognized as one of the most dangerous activities that human beings voluntarily undertake. The combination of confined spaces, complete darkness, complex three-dimensional navigation, and the relentless need for an air supply that cannot be replenished from the surrounding environment creates a margin for error so thin that only the most rigorously trained and experienced practitioners should attempt it. Many of the cave passages that regional speleologists have identified in the Cumberland Gap area have not been fully explored for precisely these reasons. A passage that a caver can enter on foot or on hands and knees may, after 100 feet or 1,000 feet, reach a sump that cannot be passed without diving equipment. It may drop into a shaft whose depth has not been established. It may narrow to a space too tight for passage, and then, visibly, open up again on the other side of that constriction into chambers that can be heard, the sound of dripping water echoing in a large space, but not reached. This is the honest reality of unmapped cave systems. They are not unmapped because someone is keeping them secret. They are not unmapped because the technology to explore them does not exist. They are unmapped because the landscape itself, in its flooding, its constriction, its vertical complexity, its sheer physical hostility to human presence, makes comprehensive exploration extraordinarily difficult, and in some cases genuinely impossible with current tools and techniques. Conservation adds another layer of genuine restriction. Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, which encompasses the gap itself and a significant surrounding area, is managed with the dual mandate of preserving both its historical and natural resources. Caves within the park boundaries are subject to management protocols designed to protect their geological formations, their unique biological communities, and the hydrological systems they are part of. Some caves are closed to general visitation. Others require permits. Some are restricted to scientific researchers with specific study purposes. These restrictions exist not to conceal what is inside the caves, but to protect environments that are extraordinarily fragile and that can be damaged, sometimes irreparably, by human visitation without appropriate protocols. The question then presents itself with quiet but genuine force. How much of the underground landscape of Cumberland Gap remains unexplored, not because of secrecy, not because of deliberate concealment, but because nature itself makes exploration extraordinarily difficult? The honest answer, based on what is known and what is not known, is a great deal. The surface geology of the region strongly suggests the presence of karst drainage systems of significant extent, systems whose full geometry has not been traced by dye studies, whose passages have not been entered by explorers, whose chambers and formations and underground rivers have never been seen by human eyes. The springs that emerge along the valley floors are fed by something. The sinkholes that dot the ridges and plateaus drain somewhere. The connections between input and output, the precise routes that water takes through the rock, are in many cases not yet established. Regional cave surveys have documented individual cave systems in the broader area, adding their measurements and observations to the growing database of Appalachian karst. The Cave Research Foundation and various regional grottos, the term used for local caving clubs affiliated with the National Speleological Society, have contributed significant survey work over the decades. But survey work in karst terrain is cumulative and slow. Each trip into a known system may add new passage. Each new entrance discovered at the surface may open into previously unknown territory. The process is not linear. It is iterative, patient, and frequently humbling. There are also practical barriers that have nothing to do with conservation restrictions or the danger of exploration. Much of the land surrounding Cumberland Gap National Historical Park is privately owned, and cave entrances on private land may be gated, ignored, or simply unknown to anyone outside the immediate landowner. Regional cave inventories are incomplete, not because no one cares, but because conducting a thorough surface survey of karst terrain requires resources and time that have not always been available. The underground landscape of the Cumberland Gap region, then, remains in significant part an open question. Not a mystery manufactured for dramatic purposes, but a genuine scientific frontier, one defined not by secrecy or conspiracy, but by the patient, difficult, incremental work of understanding a landscape that does not yield its secrets easily. It is worth pausing here and sitting with that thought for a moment. In an era when satellite imagery can map the surface of the Earth with sub-meter resolution, when deep-sea vehicles have visited the deepest trenches of the ocean, when telescopes can resolve the surfaces of planets in distant solar systems, the ground beneath a mountain pass in the eastern United States remains in significant portions unknown to human exploration. The Earth still keeps its depths. And in that keeping, there is something that feels, if you allow yourself to feel it, like a kind of gift. Every landscape old enough and strange enough eventually acquires a layer of story that is different from history. Not false, that would be too simple a judgment. Not true in the documentary sense, something in between. Stories that carry real human experiences. Fear, wonder, loss, the particular quality of imagination that darkness reliably produces, dressed in narrative forms that reflect the culture and time of their telling. In the Appalachian tradition, these stories have their own texture, their own cadence, their own unmistakable flavor of the mountains. It should be said plainly, before any of these stories are recounted, the folklore of the Cumberland Gap region is presented here as folklore. These stories are not historical evidence. They are not geological data. They are not archaeological findings. They belong to the tradition of regional storytelling, to the oral culture of the Appalachian Mountains, and their value lies in what they tell us about the human experience of a particular landscape, not in any claim they make about underground civilizations, secret passages, or supernatural phenomena. With that clearly stated, let us listen to what the mountains have been saying about themselves for the past several centuries. The stories of whispering caves are among the most persistent in the local tradition. In several accounts collected from the Blue Ridge and Cumberland Plateau region over the past 2 centuries, by folklorists, by local historians, by writers with an interest in mountain culture, there are references to caves where sounds behave in ways that feel inexplicable to the untrained ear. A voice spoken in one part of the cave is heard clearly in another part, separated by a wall of solid stone that should make such transmission impossible. A footstep echoes in a rhythm that seems to respond rather than simply repeat. Water dripping in a deep passage creates a sound that, traveling up through fissures in the rock, emerges at the surface as something uncannily close to a human voice, or so the stories go. There is actual acoustic science behind some of these phenomena. Cave passages, depending on their geometry, can act as natural acoustic waveguides, channeling sound in unexpected directions and over unexpected distances. Resonant chambers, large rooms with particular shapes and surface textures, can produce standing waves that amplify certain frequencies while dampening others. What a person hearing these effects for the first time without any knowledge of acoustics would experience is something that feels genuinely strange, sound behaving in ways that their everyday experience of the world has not prepared them for. The imagination, presented with something strange in a dark place, reaches for the nearest available explanation. In the Appalachian tradition, those explanations often involved the presence of something unseen. Lost traveler stories cluster around mountain passes and remote landscapes everywhere in the world, and Cumberland Gap is no exception. The accounts vary in their specifics, but share a common structure. A traveler, alone or separated from companions, follows a sound or a light into an unfamiliar cave entrance, becomes disoriented in the darkness, and is either rescued with great difficulty or is not rescued at all. These stories served practical purposes in frontier communities. They warned against the real dangers of entering cave systems without adequate light or companions or knowledge of the terrain. A sinkhole that opens suddenly in the forest floor. A cave passage that descends steeply into a flooded chamber. These were genuine hazards in the karst landscape, and stories that dramatized their danger were a form of community safety knowledge. The moonshiner tradition deserves a moment of specific attention because it sits at the intersection of folklore and documented historical practice. The production of illicit distilled spirits in the Appalachian Mountains has a long and well-documented history, driven by economic conditions, by the isolation of mountain communities, by the particular agricultural reality of corn, as a crop far more valuable when converted to whiskey than when sold as grain, and by a culture of independence that had complicated and sometimes hostile relationships with government taxation and regulation. Cave passages and rock shelters were, in documented historical cases in various parts of Appalachia, used by moonshiners for the storage of equipment and product. A cave entrance hidden by vegetation on a remote hillside, maintaining a stable, cool temperature, reachable by those who knew the route and invisible to those who did not. This was a practical resource for an illegal but deeply embedded industry. The stories of hidden moonshiner passages beneath the Cumberland Gap area may or may not reflect specific historical instances, but they reflect a genuine cultural reality. People did use caves for concealment. The details, as always in folklore, are elaborated in the telling. Ghost stories attached to the gap tend to follow the landscape's own history. The wilderness road was a route of genuine hardship, and people died along it, from illness, from accident, from violence, from the ordinary attrition of a difficult journey through demanding terrain. A place that has been a corridor for human movement for centuries will inevitably accumulate stories of those who did not complete their crossing, who stopped somewhere along the road and did not rise again. In the folklore tradition, such stories become haunting: the figure seen on the trail at dusk, the sound of footsteps following a solitary traveler, the voice calling from the darkness at the side of the road that turns out to have no source. These stories are not evidence of anything supernatural, but they are evidence of something real, the way that landscapes carry human history not only in their soil and their archaeology, but in the imaginative lives of the communities that inhabit them. A place like Cumberland Gap, old and strange and full of literal underground mystery, becomes a kind of imaginative reservoir. It holds not only what has physically happened within it, but what people have felt and feared and wondered about in its presence. There are also the stories of strange sounds heard at the gap itself, sounds attributed to the wind moving through the notch, in particular weather conditions, or to the acoustic properties of the rock faces on either side, or to something else entirely in the telling of those who prefer a more atmospheric explanation. Wind does behave unusually at mountain gaps. The compression and acceleration of air through a narrow opening, the way that sound waves reflect from cliff faces and carry in directions that seem counterintuitive. These are real phenomena that the untrained ear can experience as genuinely peculiar. One recurring motif in regional folklore involves the idea that the caves beneath the mountains connect over vast distances, that a passage entered on the Kentucky side of the gap might emerge, after many miles of underground travel, in Tennessee or Virginia, or even further away. This idea of an underground counterpart to the wilderness road, a hidden road through the mountain that only the most intrepid or the most fortunate traveler could find, has obvious narrative appeal. It mirrors the surface story of the gap as a passage, translating it into the underground register. Hydrogeologically, the idea is not entirely without basis. Karst systems can connect across distances of many miles, as dye tracing studies have demonstrated in comparable systems elsewhere in the Appalachians. Underground flow paths do cross beneath surface ridges. Water does travel from one drainage basin to another through the rock, but these underground connections are water passages, tight, flooded, inaccessible to human travel, not the wide underground highways of folklore imagination. The folklore takes a real quality of the landscape and amplifies it, makes it human scale, turns hydrology into adventure. That is what folklore does, and doing so is not a failure or a deception. It is a form of cultural processing, a way of making sense of a landscape that is genuinely strange, genuinely mysterious, genuinely resistant to ordinary understanding. The people who told these stories were not unintelligent or credulous. They were responding to real features of their environment with the tools available to them: narrative, imagination, and the deep human need to give strange things a shape that the mind can hold. The caves whispered, the mountains echoed, the water moved somewhere below in the dark. And people told stories about it, because that is what people do when the world around them is more than they can fully explain. The atmosphere of that tradition, the quiet strangeness of it, the way it lives in the half-light between the known and the unknown, is part of this landscape. It belongs here, alongside the geology and the archaeology and the hydrology. Not as evidence of anything hidden or supernatural, but as evidence of something deeply human. The mountains make us wonder, they always have, and wondering is where all the best stories and all the best science begin. Return for a moment to the water. Follow it as it enters the limestone, through a sinkhole, through a crack in the rock, through the roots of a tree that has found its way into a fracture in the bedding plane. Follow it downward through the unsaturated zone, through the epikarst, through fissures that grow slowly wider as the years and centuries accumulate. Follow it into the darkness, into the passages where no light penetrates. Into the stream that runs along the floor of a cave passage, perhaps 50 feet below the surface of the ground, perhaps 500 feet below, carrying with it the fine sediment of the hills above and the dissolved minerals of the stone through which it has traveled. Now stop following the water for a moment and look at what lives in it. The biology of caves is one of the genuinely astonishing chapters of natural history, a story of adaptation so extreme, so complete, and so beautifully specific that it challenges ordinary assumptions about what life requires and what it can become given sufficient time and the right conditions. Life in caves exists along a gradient, near the entrance where some light penetrates and where the temperature fluctuates with the seasons. The biological community is relatively rich and connected to the surface world. Ferns and mosses grow on cave walls within reach of faint daylight. Insects wander in from outside. Mammals use the entrance zone for shelter, raccoons, foxes, opossums, and in certain seasons, hibernating bears in larger rock shelters and shallow caves. But as you move deeper, past the twilight zone and into the dark zone where no light reaches at all, the biological community changes fundamentally. The organisms that live in permanent cave darkness are specialists of a very particular kind. They have, over thousands, and in some cases millions of years, adapted to an environment defined by three things: a complete darkness, stable temperature, and chronic food scarcity. The adaptations that result from these conditions are among the most dramatic that evolutionary biology produces. The loss of pigmentation. Cave organisms are frequently white or pale pink, their skin transparent enough that internal organs are sometimes visible, is perhaps the most immediately striking. In a world without light, the production of melanin pigment costs metabolic resources that can be directed elsewhere, and natural selection gradually eliminates it over generations. There is simply no advantage to being colored if no one can see you and you cannot see anyone else. The loss of eyes, or their reduction to vestigial remnants, follows the same logic and the same process. Eyes are expensive to build and maintain in metabolic terms. In total darkness, they provide no survival benefit. Over many generations, mutations that reduce eye development are not selected against. They may even be slightly advantageous if the resources saved can be redirected to other sensory systems. The result is the phenomenon of cave blindness. organisms that retain the genetic heritage of eyes but have no functional visual apparatus, compensated by the dramatic enhancement of other senses. In the cave streams of the southern Appalachians, the northern cavefish, Amblyopsis spelaea, is a particularly well-studied example of this adaptation. Found in cave systems of Kentucky and Indiana, this small, pale, eyeless fish navigates its underground world through an exquisitely developed lateral line system. A series of sensory cells that detect vibrations and pressure changes in the water with extraordinary sensitivity. In the absence of sight, the fish has developed a water sense so refined that it can navigate complex passage systems, locate prey, and avoid obstacles in complete darkness. It is, in its own terms, perfectly suited to its environment, not a degraded version of a surface fish, but a fully realized cave fish, optimized by evolution for an existence its surface ancestors could not have managed. The cave salamanders of the Appalachian region represent another thread in this biological story. Several species of the family Plethodontidae, the lungless salamanders, which breathe entirely through their skin, have independently evolved cave-adapted forms in different parts of the Appalachian system. The Tennessee cave salamander, Gyronophilus pallucus, is one of the better-known examples from the broader region, a pale, gilled salamander that lives in the streams and pools of cave systems in Middle Tennessee. Its gills are external and feathery, giving it an appearance more larval than adult, a trait called neoteny, the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood, which in cave salamanders may be an adaptation to the stable, food-scarce conditions of the underground environment. Bats are the most visible connection between the cave world and the surface, the organisms that daily traverse both environments and that link the underground ecosystem to the surface world in ways that are ecologically significant. The caves of the Cumberland Gap region provide roosting habitat for several bat species, including the little brown bat, Myotis lucifugus, and the big brown bat, Eptesicus fuscus, as well as the endangered Indiana bat, Myotis sodalis, which uses cave systems for its winter hibernation in dense, temperature-sensitive clusters. Bats are not simply cave residents. They are cave processors, animals whose bodies transform the insects they eat at the surface into organic material deposited underground in the form of guano. Bat guano is the primary energy input for many cave ecosystems. In caves with significant bat populations, the guano accumulates in deep piles on the cave floor, supporting a community of invertebrates, beetles, flies, mites, millipedes, pseudoscorpions, that feed on the guano directly or on the microorganisms that break it down. This invertebrate community, in turn, supports predators, cave spiders and harvestmen, cave salamanders, and the occasional wandering surface predator that ventures into the entrance zone. Cave crickets, members of the family Rhaphidophoridae, are among the most important and most widespread cave invertebrates in North America. They are not true cave obligates in most cases. They move freely between the cave and the surface world, foraging outside at night and returning to the cave to roost during the day. In doing so, they bring organic matter into the cave on their bodies and in their digestive systems, serving as another energy link between the surface and underground worlds. Their long, delicate antennae, extended forward to sense the cave environment through touch, give them an appearance that people either find fascinating or deeply unsettling. There seems to be little middle ground on the subject of cave crickets. The invertebrates that live permanently in cave streams, the isopods, amphipods, flatworms, and other small crustaceans and worms that spend their entire lives in the water of cave passages, represent perhaps the deepest level of cave adaptation. Many of these organisms are endemic to individual cave systems or even individual stream passages, having been isolated from their surface relatives for long enough that genetic differentiation has made them distinct species. The degree of specialization of many cave invertebrates means that they are exquisitely sensitive to any changes in their environment. Changes in water chemistry, temperature, flow rate, or sediment load can devastate populations that have no ability to move to alternative habitat. This sensitivity makes cave invertebrates important indicators of the health of the karst groundwater system. Because they live in the water that moves through the limestone, they are exposed to everything that enters that water: agricultural chemicals, road salt, septic system effluent, the whole range of pollutants that flow into sinkholes and cave entrances from the surface above. Monitoring cave invertebrate communities is one way that scientists track the quality of karst groundwater and the health of the underground ecosystem. The mineral formations of caves, the speleothems, are themselves a kind of life record, though not biological life. Stalactites, stalagmites, flowstone, cave pearls, and the exquisite crystalline formations called cave flowers or anthodites are built by the same chemistry that builds cave passages, mineral-rich water depositing calcium carbonate as it moves through the cave atmosphere. These formations are extraordinarily fragile. A stalactite that has been growing for 10,000 years can be broken by a single careless hand. The oils from human skin, deposited on a speleothem surface, can inhibit future growth or change the color of the formation permanently. This fragility is a significant part of the reason that many caves are closed to general visitation. But speleothems are also scientific archives of remarkable value. Because they incorporate oxygen isotopes and trace elements from the water that builds them, in ratios that reflect the temperature, rainfall, and vegetation of the surface world at the time each layer was deposited, they preserve a high-resolution climate record extending back tens of thousands of years. Speleothem paleoclimate research has become one of the most productive fields in quaternary science. The study of the past 2 million years of Earth's environmental history, and caves in the Appalachian region have contributed important data to our understanding of how climate has changed in the eastern United States through multiple glacial and interglacial cycles. The underground world of the Cumberland Gap region, then, is not simply a geological feature. It is a living system, biologically diverse, ecologically complex, scientifically valuable in multiple dimensions, and fragile in ways that demand careful stewardship. The organisms that inhabit it have spent thousands to millions of years becoming precisely what they are. The formations that decorate its walls have been growing in darkness since before any human being stood at the gap and looked westward into the interior of the continent. They deserve the silence they have always had, and they deserve the careful attention of the science that is slowly, patiently learning to understand them. There is a particular kind of patience required to map what cannot be seen from above. A surface geologist can fly over a landscape in a small plane or study satellite imagery from a desk and read the broad story of the terrain in the shapes of ridges and valleys, in the color and texture of exposed rock faces, in the pattern of drainage and vegetation that reflects the geology beneath. The work is complex and requires deep expertise, but the subject of study is at least visible, at least present in the light, available to the eye and to the instruments that extend the eye's reach. A speleologist mapping an underground passage works in a different world entirely. The subject of study is present only in the small cone of light that the headlamp produces. Beyond that cone, everything is dark. The passage ahead is unknown until you are in it. The passage behind is invisible the moment you round a corner. The three-dimensional geometry of the system, how the passages relate to one another, how they connect, how the cave sits within the rock of the mountain, must be reconstructed mentally and mathematically from a series of individual measurements taken in darkness, one station at a time. Over many trips spread across many years, traditional cave surveying is done with a compass, a clinometer, and a tape measure. At each survey station, a marked point in the cave, the surveyor measures the distance to the next station, the compass bearing of the passage direction, and the inclination, whether the passage runs uphill or downhill, and by how much. Additional measurements record the width and height of the passage at each station. These raw numbers are then entered into surveying software that assembles them through mathematical computation into a map of the cave in 2 dimensions or a 3-dimensional model if the measurements are precise enough and the software sophisticated enough. The process is slow. A skilled survey team working in good conditions, a wide, dry passage with clear sight lines, might survey several hundred feet in a single trip. In difficult conditions, tight crawlways, deep water, vertical pitches, broken terrain, progress may be measured in tens of feet per trip. And every new passage discovered adds more work to be done. A cave system that appears from the surface to occupy a small area of ground may, underground, contain miles of passage, arranged in a complex 3-dimensional network that takes years or decades to survey completely. The National Speleological Society, founded in 1941, has been the primary organizing body for cave exploration and survey work in the United States, coordinating the efforts of regional grottos and specialized sections focused on cave diving, cave photography, cave cartography, and cave science. The Cave Research Foundation, established in 1957 with an initial focus on the Mammoth Cave system, has contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of cave systems throughout the Appalachian and broader American karst regions. These organizations have, over the decades, assembled an extraordinary body of data about American caves, passage maps, biological surveys, hydrological studies, geological observations, that forms the foundation of scientific knowledge about underground America. In the Cumberland Gap region, cave survey work has been conducted by regional grottos and individual explorers over many decades, contributing data to the broader regional understanding of Appalachian karst. The work is ongoing and incomplete. Each survey season adds new data. Each new entrance discovered opens new questions. The boundary between the known and the unknown in these systems is not a fixed line, but a constantly shifting frontier, moving inward as exploration progresses and expanding outward as new passages are found. Modern technology has brought new tools to this ancient problem of mapping the invisible. LIDAR, light detection and ranging, has transformed the study of karst surface topography in ways that were simply not possible with traditional surveying methods. A LIDAR system mounted on an aircraft or drone emits millions of laser pulses per second and measures the time each pulse takes to return after reflecting from the ground surface. The result is a point cloud, a three-dimensional representation of the surface terrain with centimeter-scale resolution that can see through vegetation canopy to the ground beneath. In karst terrain, LIDAR imagery reveals sinkholes, collapse features, karst windows, and subtle topographic depressions with a clarity that traditional aerial photography cannot match. A LIDAR map of karst terrain looks, to the trained eye, like a map of the underground system projected onto the surface, the sinkholes marking input points, the linear depressions marking the paths of underground drainage, the spring locations confirming the exit points of the system. LIDAR has been applied to karst mapping in the broader Appalachian region with significant results, revealing the extent and organization of surface karst features in areas that had never been comprehensively mapped before. In the context of Cumberland Gap National Historical Park and the surrounding region, LIDAR data has contributed to a better understanding of where karst features are concentrated and where underground drainage is most likely to be active, helping to focus both exploration efforts and conservation management. Three-dimensional cave mapping has advanced significantly with the development of laser scanning technology adapted for underground use. A portable laser scanner positioned at a station inside a cave can capture a precise three-dimensional point cloud of the surrounding passage geometry, wall surfaces, ceiling contours, floor topography in minutes. Multiple scans from different stations, registered together through common reference points, can be assembled into a complete three-dimensional model of a cave passage or chamber with millimeter-scale accuracy. The resulting models are not simply maps. They are virtual environments that can be explored on a computer screen, measured, analyzed, and shared with researchers and conservationists who may never physically enter the cave. This technology has particular value for passages that are too fragile, too sensitive, or too dangerous for frequent human visitation. A single careful scanning expedition can produce a model that allows years of scientific study without further disturbance to the cave environment. The model preserves the cave as it existed at the moment of scanning, a record that will remain accurate even if the cave formations change, or if the passage is altered by a flood event, or if conservation management decisions restrict future access. Hydrogeological monitoring within and around cave systems has become increasingly sophisticated. Water level loggers, small electronic instruments that record water pressure and temperature at regular intervals over extended periods, can be installed at springs in cave streams, and in monitoring wells to build a continuous record of how the underground water system responds to rainfall events, seasonal changes, and longer-term climate variability. The data these instruments collect, analyzed alongside rainfall records and surface stream gauges, allows hydrogeologists to construct increasingly detailed models of how water moves through the karst system, how long it takes rainfall to travel from a sinkhole input to a spring output, how the system responds to drought, how quickly it recovers from flood events. Dye tracing, the technique of introducing fluorescent dye at a known input point and monitoring for its appearance at springs and other output points, remains one of the most powerful tools for understanding karst connectivity, and its application in the Cumberland Gap region and surrounding karst areas has contributed to a growing understanding of the underground drainage network. Each successful dye trace establishes a confirmed hydraulic connection between 2 points in the landscape, adding a data point to the map of a system that is otherwise invisible. The accumulation of these data points over many years and many individual studies gradually reveals the architecture of the underground world, not completely, not all at once, but piece by careful piece. Climate research inside caves has emerged as one of the most scientifically significant contributions of cave science to the broader understanding of Earth's past environments. The speleothems that grow in cave passages, stalactites, stalagmites, and flowstones, are now understood to be among the most valuable natural archives of past climate conditions available to scientists. The uranium-thorium dating method, which exploits the known decay rates of radioactive isotopes incorporated into speleothems as they grow, allows researchers to establish precise ages for cave formations going back hundreds of thousands of years. Coupled with analysis of oxygen isotope ratios and trace element concentrations within the formations, these ages allow the construction of detailed climate records spanning timescales far beyond the reach of written history or instrumental observation. Research on speleothems from caves in the Appalachian region has contributed to understanding how the regional climate of the eastern United States has changed through the major glacial cycles of the past several 100,000 years, how rainfall patterns shifted, how temperatures fluctuated, how the vegetation of the surface world responded to changes in the global climate system. This research does not require the largest or most famous cave systems. A single well-chosen stalagmite from a modest cave passage, carefully sampled and analyzed, can yield climate data of extraordinary scientific value. Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, established in 1940 and encompassing more than 24,000 acres across the corners of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, manages its underground resources within a conservation framework that balances scientific access with protection of fragile cave environments. The park's management of cave resources reflects the broader philosophy of the National Park Service, that natural resources held in public ownership should be preserved unimpaired for the enjoyment and benefit of future generations. And that scientific research conducted within park boundaries should contribute to the understanding and stewardship of those resources. The partnership between park management and the scientific community, speleologists, hydrogeologists, biologists, paleoclimatologists, represents the most productive model for advancing understanding of these underground landscapes. Scientists with specific research questions and appropriate permits bring specialized expertise and equipment to bear on questions that park management alone could not address. Park staff bring local knowledge, long-term monitoring data, and conservation authority that gives the scientific work its appropriate context and accountability. The result, at its best, is a body of knowledge that grows steadily more complete and more useful, while the landscape itself is protected well enough that future researchers will find it in the same condition as those who came before. Each expedition into the underground landscape of the Cumberland Gap region, each survey trip, each dye trace, each speleothem sample carefully extracted from a cave passage by a scientist who has spent weeks obtaining the appropriate permits and planning the least invasive sampling approach, adds another piece to a puzzle whose full picture has not yet come into focus. The puzzle is not simply a scientific one. It is a geographical, historical, biological, and in the deepest sense, a philosophical one. It asks us to consider what it means to know a place, truly know it, not just its surface, but its depth, not just its present, but its past. Not just what it looks like, but what it contains and what it records, and what it is quietly becoming in the darkness that we cannot see. That question has no final answer. But the asking of it, year after year, trip by trip, measurement by careful measurement, is its own kind of answer, the answer that science gives, which is not a destination but a direction. And the direction, for now, is down. Let us be honest about what we do not know. In an era that prizes certainty, that rewards confident conclusions and complete narratives, there is a particular intellectual courage required to sit with genuine uncertainty, to look at a landscape as rich and as complex as Cumberland Gap and say simply and without apology, we have not finished understanding this. We may not finish understanding this within our lifetimes or within many lifetimes to come. The unmapped passages that almost certainly exist within the karst systems of the Cumberland Gap region are not the product of imagination or wishful thinking. They are the logical inference from the surface geology, from the pattern of springs and sinkholes and cave entrances, from the known behavior of karst systems in comparable geological settings throughout the Appalachians. The water that enters the ground must go somewhere. The connections between input and output must follow roots through the rock. Those roots exist whether or not any human explorer has entered them, measured them, or seen them. How extensive those roots are, what scale of underground network lies beneath the gap and its surrounding ridges, is genuinely unknown. The geological setting is one that supports significant karst development. The limestone formations are thick, the fracture systems well developed, the history of groundwater circulation long. Whether that translates into a few miles of cave passage or many tens of miles, whether the system contains mostly tight, flooded tubes or includes significant dry passage and large chambers. These are questions that only further exploration and hydrogeological study can begin to answer. The climate records preserved in speleothems within the caves of the region represent one of the most scientifically important categories of what the mountains still keep. Every cave that contains actively growing stalagmites contains, within those formations, a chronicle of the past climate of the region, a record that extends beyond any written history, beyond any instrumental measurement, into the deep past of the landscape itself. The resolution and completeness of these records depends on the growth rate of the formations and the continuity of their deposition, factors that vary from cave to cave and from formation to formation, but that in favorable cases can provide year-by-year or even seasonal scale information about rainfall and temperature stretching back tens of thousands of years. What those records contain, what the climate of the Cumberland Gap region looked like at the height of the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. How quickly the climate warmed as the ice sheets retreated, how droughts and wet periods alternated through the Holocene, how the regional climate of the past millennium compares to the longer patterns. These are questions of both scientific and practical significance. Understanding how the climate of the region has varied naturally over long timescales provides essential context for interpreting present trends and projecting future ones. The archaeological dimension of what the mountains still keep is perhaps the most poignant. The human story of Cumberland Gap stretches back at least 14,000 years, and that story is preserved in fragmentary form across the landscape, in rock shelters, in cave floors, in buried soil horizons, along ancient campsites, in the sediments of sinkholes that have been collecting material since the last ice age. The portions of that story that have been recovered through archaeological excavation represent a small fraction of what exists. Archaeological sites in karst terrain face particular preservation challenges and particular preservation opportunities. The acidic soils that develop on limestone can destroy bone and organic material that might survive in more neutral environments. But cave and rock shelter deposits, protected from surface weathering, can preserve organic remains, bone, wood, plant material, fiber, in extraordinary condition for thousands of years. The archaic and woodland period organic materials recovered from rock shelter sites throughout the Appalachians have provided researchers with detailed information about diet, technology, and lifeways that open-air sites cannot match. Future archaeological research in the Cumberland Gap region, conducted with the rigorous methodological standards and the ethical frameworks for Indigenous consultation that modern archaeology requires, may reveal details of the human story of this landscape that are not yet known. New sites will be found. Existing sites will be more fully investigated. The techniques available to archaeologists, ancient DNA analysis, isotopic dietary reconstruction, high-resolution radiocarbon dating, microscopic analysis of plant residues on stone tools continue to advance, allowing researchers to extract more information from the material that survives. The relationship between future discoveries and indigenous knowledge and memory is something that deserves careful thought. The oral traditions of the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Yuchi, and other nations whose ancestors lived in and traveled through this region carry knowledge of the landscape and its history that is not captured in any archaeological record. That knowledge is living knowledge, held within communities, maintained through practice and story and ceremony, subject to its own processes of change and continuity. The relationship between that living knowledge and the findings of archaeology is not one of simple confirmation or contradiction. It is a relationship between different kinds of knowing, each with its own standards of evidence and its own forms of authority. The scientific study of Cumberland Gap, its geology, its hydrology, its biology, its archaeological record, is not a process that will reach a final conclusion. Every answer genuinely reached opens new questions. Every passage mapped leads to another unmapped one. Every speleothem analyzed raises new questions about the climate system it records. Every archaeological site excavated reveals new complexity in the human story of the region. This is not a failure of science. It is the nature of complex landscapes studied by a species whose tools and understanding, however impressive, remain finite in the face of 400 million years of geological history and 14,000 years of human presence. The mystery that surrounds Cumberland Gap, the genuine, scientifically grounded mystery, as distinct from any manufactured or sensational version of it, does not arise from secrecy or concealment. It arises from the sheer complexity of the landscape, from the depth of geological time, from the difficulty of the terrain, from the fragility of underground environments that must be protected even as they are studied. It arises, ultimately, from the simple fact that the Earth is old and deep and extraordinarily intricate, and that our understanding of it, while growing steadily, remains magnificently incomplete. There is something in that incompleteness that deserves not frustration but wonder. The mountains still keep their depths. The underground rivers still run in their darkness, carrying the dissolved minerals of 400-million-year-old stone towards springs that have been flowing longer than any human memory reaches. The cave formations still grow, grain by grain, in passages that may not be entered for generations. The organisms that live in the underground waters, pale, eyeless, perfectly adapted to a world of complete darkness and patient chemistry, continue their lives with the same indifference to human awareness that they have always maintained. All of this continues, quietly and without urgency, beneath the feet of anyone who stands at the gap and looks at the mountains and wonders what lies beneath. The wondering is appropriate. The wondering is, in fact, the right response, because the mountains are not finished with their story. They are, in the deep time of geology and biology and hydrology, barely past their opening pages, and we are very new readers, still learning the language. The light changes at Cumberland Gap in the evening the same way it does in the morning, gradually, gently, without drama. The sun moves behind the western ridgeline, and the direct light goes first from the valley floors, then from the middle slopes, then finally from the highest points of the eastern ridges, leaving only a faint brightness in the sky above, a luminous grey-blue that deepens slowly through every shade between afternoon and night, unhurried, as if the transition from day to dark is something the mountains have always been willing to take their time with. The mist returns in the evening as it came in the morning. It pools again in the low places. It softens again the edges of things. The creek at the valley bottom becomes again a sound rather than a sight. The far ridgeline dissolves into the gathering dark, with the patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time and knows exactly how it ends. The gap itself, that quiet notch in the ridgeline, that accidental opening in the wall of the Appalachians, sits in the evening light with the same unceremonious presence it has always had. It does not look like a place of great importance. It looks like a gap in the mountains, but appearances, as this long day of looking beneath surfaces has shown us, are only the beginning of any real understanding. Stand here in this fading light and think about geological time. The limestone beneath your feet was laid down on the floor of a warm, shallow sea roughly 400 million years ago. The creatures whose remains make up this stone lived their entire lives and died before the first land plants had fully established themselves on the continents. Before the first fish had crawled onto a mudflat and begun the long evolutionary journey that would eventually produce, among millions of other things, the creature standing here looking at the mountains. The stone is not simply old. It is old in a way that reorders the ordinary sense of time, that makes the entire span of human history, all of it, from the first stone tools to the present moment, feel like a brief and recent episode. And yet human history, brief as it is in geological terms, is layered through this landscape with a density and a complexity that is its own kind of deep. Think of the Paleo-Indian hunter moving through the forest somewhere on these ridges 14,000 years ago, following the tracks of a mastodon through a landscape that was cooler and different from today's, navigating by the logic of terrain and season and accumulated knowledge that had no written form but was no less precise for that. Think of the archaic people who returned season after season to a rock shelter on the cliff face, building fires against the same stone that is still there, looking out over a valley that was already ancient when they sat in it. Think of the woodland communities whose exchange networks reached from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, whose ceremonial practices reflected an understanding of the world that was sophisticated and coherent and entirely their own. Think of the Cherokee people for whom these mountains were not simply a place, but a living presence woven through every dimension of their understanding: spiritual, practical, historical, aesthetic. Think of the Shawnee hunters, whose knowledge of the Kentucky interior was precise enough to guide their long journeys through it with confidence. Think of the Yuchi, whose distinct language and culture have survived pressures that have erased many other peoples entirely, whose connection to this landscape runs through their own particular history in ways that no outside observer can fully comprehend. Think of Thomas Walker, writing in his journal by firelight on the evening of April 13th, 1750. Recording the gap in the mountains with the matter-of-fact brevity of a practical man who had no way of knowing that the place he was noting in his journal would become one of the most significant passages in American frontier history. Think of Daniel Boone. Moving through these woods with the particular kind of attention that comes from a lifetime of learning from a landscape. Reading sign in the way a leaf has been turned, or the way a branch has been broken, or the way the moss grows differently on the north side of a stone. A man so at home in the forest that the forest itself seemed to accept him in a way it did not accept most people who passed through it. Think of the settlers, the 200,000, the 300,000, who walked or rode through this gap with everything they owned and everything they hoped for, their eyes on the horizon to the west, the mountains behind them for the last time. Each of them carried a private story that the historical record has not preserved. Each of them crossed a threshold that changed the direction of their life. The gap received them all, the hopeful and the desperate, the adventurous and the terrified, the survivors and those who would not survive, and let them through as it had always let things through, without judgment and without ceremony. And beneath all of them, always, the water moved, through the limestone, through the passages carved by centuries of gentle chemistry, through the underground rivers that have no name and no map, that carry the dissolved minerals of ancient seafloor through darkness so complete that light is not a concept that has any meaning there. Through the chambers where cave formations have been growing since before any human foot touched the surface of this land. Through the underground ecosystems where pale, eyeless creatures live their entire lives in a silence deeper than any silence the surface world can produce. The water does not know about frontiers or sacred crossings or geological theories or folklore or cave surveys or climate records. The water simply moves as it has always moved, following the path that the stone offers, carrying the past with it in the only language that water knows, the language of chemistry and gravity and time. But we know about these things. Or we are beginning to know, which is a different condition, more honest, more appropriate to our actual situation. We are beginning to understand the geological story of these mountains. We are beginning to read the climate archive written in cave formations. We are beginning to trace the connections between sinkholes and springs, between the surface world and the underground one. We are beginning, very carefully and very slowly, to map the invisible. And in the spaces between what we have learned and what we have not yet learned, the landscape continues to be what it has always been, vast and patient and full of a complexity that our instruments and our intellects can approach, but never fully exhaust. That is not a disappointment. It is, if you let it be, a comfort, a world that can be fully understood and fully mapped and fully explained leaves nowhere for wonder to live. The Cumberland Gap, with its 400 million years of geological history, its 14,000 years of human presence, its unmapped cave passages, and its underground rivers, and its pale cave creatures, and its climate records waiting in the dark, is a place where wonder has always had room, considerable room. Room that will not run out in our lifetimes or in many lifetimes after ours. The wind moves through the gap as the last light leaves the sky. It is a gentle wind tonight, a movement of air rather than a true wind, the kind that you feel on the skin rather than here in the trees, the kind that carries the cool of the coming night in from the valleys on both sides of the mountains. The gap channels it in its characteristic way, a slight compression and acceleration through the notch, a whisper of moving air where the ridgeline opens. If you stand in exactly the right place, you can feel it on both sides of your face at once, the air from Kentucky and the air from Virginia, meeting briefly in the passage between worlds. Below your feet, through several feet of soil, and then into the limestone that goes down farther than any measurement you can take without instruments, the water is moving. It has been moving all day, all year, all century, all millennium. A gentle trickling somewhere in a tight passage. A small waterfall dropping into a dark pool, in a chamber that no human eye has seen. An underground stream running clear and cold over a gravel bed, carrying with it the fine silt of eroded hillside and the dissolved minerals of the stone it has been slowly, patiently dissolving for longer than there have been human beings on this continent. The sound of it does not reach the surface tonight. The gap is quiet. The mist is settling into the valleys. The first stars are appearing above the eastern ridgeline, pale and tentative in the early dark, gathering confidence as the sky deepens. And the mountains, these old, rounded, patient mountains, worn down from their ancient heights by 300 million years of weather and water and slow geological change, the mountains simply stand. They have seen the seas that made them. They have been pushed up by colliding continents and worn down by the patient indifference of rain. They have watched the megafauna move through their valleys and disappear. They have known the footsteps of people for 14,000 years, footsteps that changed in their equipment and their language and their purpose, but that shared across all that time. The same fundamental quality of human movement through a landscape that was larger and older and deeper than any individual life could fully comprehend. They have been crossed and quarried and surveyed and studied and celebrated and overlooked and protected and threatened and loved in their quiet way. By everyone who has ever stood at the gap and felt the wind move through it and understood even without words for the understanding that this was a place where something old and something important had been happening for a very long time. They will continue standing when we are gone. The water will continue moving. The cave formations will continue their slow, grain-by-grain growth in the dark. The pale cave fish will continue navigating their underground rivers by the pressure of the water against their skin. The bats will continue flying out at dusk and returning at dawn, crossing the boundary between underground and surface world with the easy fluency of creatures who have never needed to choose between them, and somewhere in a passage that no map has recorded. In a darkness that no light has touched, a drop of water falls from a limestone ceiling and strikes the surface of an underground pool, and the sound of it, small and clear and perfect, travels outward through the stone and through the karst and through the deep slow time of mountains and is gone, and the silence returns, and the mountains keep what the mountains keep.